So, quorum being present, the committee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time pursuant to Committee Rule 4 and Clause 2H4 of House Rule 11. The chair announces she may postpone further proceedings today if a recorded vote is ordered on the question of approving a measure or matter or on adopting an amendment. I'm advised that our ranking member is in the elevator on his way and that we should proceed, so we will, and I will do so with my making a few remarks. Today, really, we're considering H.R. 1980, the Smithsonian Women's History Museum Act. This legislation will establish a comprehensive women's history museum within the Smithsonian Institution. I'd like to commend our colleague from New York, Representative Carolyn Maloney, whose tireless advocacy over more than 2 decades laid the foundation for today's markup. As a result of her hard work and the hard work of others, this bill has 293 co-sponsors, including 59 Republicans. In fact, this bill is so popular that it was placed on the consensus calendar, which was established at the beginning of this Congress for bills with at least 290 co-sponsors that have not been reported out of the committee. I applaud Congresswoman Maloney's use of this new calendar, and I'm pleased to now exercise our committee's jurisdiction during this markup. It's impossible to tell the story of America without telling the story of American women. From the days of our nation's infancy through today, the United States has benefited from the contributions and sacrifices of women. In colonial times, the Daughters of Liberty helped spark the American Revolution. In our early days of independence, Sacagawea guided Lewis and Clark on their infamous expedition. In the lead up to the Civil War, Harriet Tubman escaped from slavery and guided dozens of slaves to freedom. A few decades later, women like Susan B. Anthony dedicated their lives to the fight for women's suffrage. During World War II, 6.5 million women entered the labor force to support the war effort. One of them was my mother, who worked at the Douglas Aircraft plant in South San Francisco making planes for the war effort. Later in the 20th century, Rosa Parks sparked the Montgomery bus boycott, and Sandra Day O'Connor took the bench as the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court. In 2007, we elected our first woman Speaker of the House, and in 2019, we elected the same woman again. And the American people sent an unprecedented 117 women to represent them here in Congress. However, even with these and countless other accomplishments by women in the U.S., historical accounts, monuments, and museums disproportionately represent the achievements of men while neglecting those of women. A variety of studies have shown that history textbooks discuss the accomplishments of men exponentially more often than those of women. As a report from the commission established by Congress to assess the need for a women's museum stated, of the 44 national memorials managed by the National Park Service, only one specifically honors the achievements of women. The contributions and experience of American women deserve celebration and recognition, and I can think of few better ways to do so than by establishing a Women's History Museum at the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian Women's History Museum Act mirrors the highly successful National Museum of African American History and Culture Act. Like that bill, this bill calls for a 50-50 split between federal and non-federal funding, a model that worked very well for the African American History Museum. It also expresses a preference for a museum site on the National Mall. I'm hopeful that today, nearly 100 years after women were granted the right to vote, we will take the first step in creating a museum to recognize these achievements and to inspire future generations. I would now like to recognize our ranking member, Mr. Davis, for any comments he may like to offer.
Thank you, Chairperson Lofgren. Since its establishment in 1846, the Smithsonian has become the world's largest museum, education, and research organization. The institution preserves and celebrates our nation's cultural heritage and advances scientific discovery in multiple disciplines. On behalf of the American people, Congress, the Board of Regents, and Smithsonian management have a responsibility to ensure the continued success of the institution for future generations. The Smithsonian has a broad mission: the increase and diffusion of knowledge and a bold strategic plan to support that mission. A critical goal in the plan is to reach 1 billion people a year through a digital-first strategy, making the Smithsonian's rich collections, first-class research, and empowering educational materials accessible to Americans across the country, not just those that visit Washington, should be a fundamental part of the institution's strategy moving forward. The Smithsonian, if able, should also have museums and exhibits that allow every American to feel represented. I believe a women's history museum, like what we are voting on today, could help the Smithsonian accomplish that critical goal, and I look forward to discussing this proposal today. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Without objection, the opening statements of all other members will be included in the record. I now call up H.R. 1980. The clerk shall report the title of the legislation.
Okay, 1980, a bill to establish in the Smithsonian Institution a comprehensive women's history museum and for other purposes. Section 1, short title.
Without objection, the reading of the bill is waived. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. Does any member seek recognition?
Madam Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentleman is recognized, and the clerk will report the amendment, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
The amendment to H.R. 1980 offered by Mr. Walker of North Carolina.
By unanimous consent, the amendment is considered as read. Mr. Walker.
Thank you. As this museum has been discussed in the past, Madam Chairwoman, many of my colleagues have expressed concern that prominent women and conservative viewpoints will not be properly depicted in museum programming. This amendment serves to ensure that all viewpoints will be represented. It is my hope that the museum will recognize women of all backgrounds who have paved the way for others in all industries and fields, including right here in the United States Congress. The very first woman elected to Congress was Republican Jeanette Rankin. Ms. Rankin was even elected before all women in the United States had the right to vote. She said, "I may be the first woman member of Congress, but I won't be the last." She was right. Her words rang true. More than 300 women of several different political parties have served in Congress since 1917. During this time, we've also seen the rise of figures like Condoleezza Rice, Elaine Chao, and on the Congress side, Shirley Chisholm and Mary Norton. As a father of two daughters, I am proud to honor the achievements of these women and many others from both sides of the aisle, as their hard work will give the next generation limitless opportunities. I urge my colleagues on this amendment to guarantee diverse viewpoints and equal representation as the plans for this museum move forward. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Does any other member wish to be heard on the amendment? If not, I would simply say we were happy to accept this amendment. It would not be the museum we want if everyone wasn't represented, and we certainly approve of this amendment, and we'll move to a vote. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All opposed will say no. The clerk can note this was a unanimous vote to accept the amendment.
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
The legislation before us today establishes a comprehensive women's history museum within the Smithsonian. In the 113th Congress, I supported the legislation creating the commission which studied this issue. In its final report, that commission unanimously recommended the museum's creation. Women have made significant contributions to the American experience, and I agree with the commission that those contributions deserve to be recognized in a dedicated national museum. With 293 bipartisan co-sponsors, it's clear this legislation has broad support within the House and is eligible to be placed on the consensus calendar. I welcome this new provision in House rules as a way for measures with broad-based support to be considered. If it had been available in the past, it would have been a helpful tool for me to use with some legislation that I've sponsored in the past. I speak from experience that it is frustrating to see a bill with deep bipartisan support be held hostage by a few individuals. I will vote today to move this bill to the floor, given that so many of my colleagues support it. However, I do want to note that I'm concerned that the committee has not held a hearing specifically focused on this bill as we did for legislation establishing the National Museum of the American Indian and National Museum of African American History and Culture. The committee has a responsibility to fully examine both the specific proposal as well as the Smithsonian's ability to stand up a new museum while maintaining its existing facilities and collections. To help ensure the success of the museum, we and our colleagues must be cognizant of the scope of what that endeavor and federal commitment will be required for its success. I recognize the important work of the Commission and value its report. However, their work should inform us but not replace Congress's role to study the issue independently. While this legislation and the topic of a new Smithsonian museum was mentioned in a cursory way at the committee's October 17th hearing, major issues were not explored in depth. These issues include, first, the size. The museum's size will impact the location and cost of the museum. The Commission's report and the CBO cost estimate envision a museum of under 100,000 square feet, significantly smaller than other Smithsonian history museums. Is this adequate to cover the scope and the breadth of a women's history museum? Would an additional building be required for off-site collection storage? And if so, should it be authorized in this legislation? The Smithsonian's response to my recent inquiry indicates the size should be no less than 350,000 square feet. And I've asked the CBO to revise its estimate based on this information. If CBO's estimate of $190 million relies on a flawed assumption of the museum size, we have an obligation to correct it and inform members of the realistic figure for federal costs to support the museum. Second, the location. H.R. 1980 directs the Board of Regents to select from one of two sites or an alternate location identified by the board within 6 months of enactment. Has a comprehensive site assessment been conducted to determine suitability for a museum of the appropriate size? If not, is 6 months enough time for such an assessment to be completed? The two sites identified in the bill are under the jurisdiction of the Architect of the Capitol and the National Park Service. My question is, do these entities have any concerns that should be addressed? Third, I wonder about the capacity of the Smithsonian to handle a new museum. As the committee is aware, and the Commission report noted, the Smithsonian faces several facilities challenges: a deferred maintenance backlog of over $1 billion, a $900 million renovation of the National Air and Space Museum, and 47% of collection storage space identified as unacceptable. What is the Smithsonian-specific plan and timing to address these issues, and how will the addition of a new museum impact that plan? Finally, the cost. What is the expectation of federal funding needed to address the maintenance backlog, support ongoing facilities care, and provide for the construction and operating costs of a new museum? Absent a hearing in advance of this markup, I hope the committee can pursue any other appropriate mechanisms to examine these issues with the intention of providing a solid foundation for the creation and making a reality the Smithsonian Women's History Museum. And thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. I think this is an important day in moving forward on this issue. As you know, in past years, we've had hearings, and you're right, we had a less detailed discussion with Secretary Bunch. But I was taken by his comment when he appeared before us that it took him 10 years to stand up the African American Museum, and you don't get there unless you start. So really, this is a matter of starting. We're going to have to keep oversight on this project. I'm sure there are things that will change. This is an authorization, not an appropriation, so this doesn't mean this is necessarily going to happen. It's subject to appropriations. But if we don't take this first step, we know it won't happen. And so this is a very important day for our committee and for our country to begin the process of this creation.
Madam Chair, I move to strike the last word.
I'm not quite finished.
Okay.
And I will yield to you in a minute. I just, I wanted to note also, because I don't think we publicized this, but we have, Mr. Davis and I, reached out to the Interior Subcommittee of the Appropriations Committee, requesting robust funding in fiscal year 2021 to address the Smithsonian's backlog of maintenance. It's time to step forward and deal with that issue. And I remember years ago, Vic Fazio was first ranking member and then chairman of this committee, and they decided they had to do something about the deferred maintenance in the Library of Congress and in the Botanical Gardens. And it was not cheap, but these buildings are held in trust by us for the public. And so they saved, really, the library, the historic building, from further deterioration, as well as the Botanical Gardens and the public benefits from that today. So I'm hopeful that we can approach that in that same spirit, the Smithsonian backlog. And I was grateful that Mr. Davis joined me in sending that letter to the Appropriations Committee, and now I would happily yield to Mr. Davis for further comments he might have.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I too believe this is an historic day, and I do believe that we will have nothing but a bipartisan vote and bipartisan support to move this important legislation forward. I felt it was just necessary for us to bring up some of the concerns, and I look forward to addressing those through the oversight process. Look forward to working with you, advocating for this project to move forward with our appropriations subcommittees and committee. And I am excited to see the bipartisanship that we're going to be able to exhibit tonight, and I will yield back.
Unless there are further requests to speak or further amendments, the question is on H.R. 1980 as amended. All in favor will say aye. 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 All opposed will say no. The clerk will note that that has passed unanimously with no votes. The question is on reporting 1980. Let's see, we just did that. We have to have a authorization to let the staff make any technical and conforming changes, and so without objection, that is ordered. I thought we did do that, reporting it. We agreed to the amendment. The question is on reporting H.R. 1980 as amended favorably to the House. All those who are in favor will say aye. Aye. And we should note that our member Susan Davis, whose flight was delayed from California, is here in time to cast her vote for final passage of 1980. All those opposed, no? There are no noes? So that is now reported favorably. The staff is given authorization to make technical and conforming changes without objection, and there being no further business before the committee. Thank you, members, for participating in this great first day and first big step forward on the creation of this Women's Museum, and we are adjourned.